Greetings. Welcome to our discussion of Geoffrey Chaucer and Christine de Pizan. This week we're talking about one of the tales from Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. Actually, just to briefly go over the reading for what I want you to look at this week. The stuff I posted is all here on Blackboard. I'd like you to take a look at the prologue. I posted an a modern English translation of the full prologue to the Canterbury Tales, so please read that. I also posted the Miller's Tale, which includes this one-page prologue, and then the tale is down here, so I'd also like you to take a look at that. This version also includes some Spark Notes, so feel free to peruse those if you feel like you need help. And the last thing I posted is a PDF from our book of an excerpt from the letter from the God of Love by Christine de Pizan. If you open your version and it looks like this, you can just click up here and rotate it until it, looks better. So just take a look at that as well. It's only a couple pages. Okay. A little bit of background about Geoffrey Chaucer. Again, his years here are 1340 to 1400. He's important because he's the poet who endows the English vernacular with a status equal to other European vernaculars. So the reason we're reading him after Boccaccio is not only because he's heavily influenced by Boccaccio, but this is essentially what Boccaccio did for Italian. He kind of wrote a work to be accessible to the common tongue. Again, if you wrote anything during this period, during the Middle Ages, it was usually written for an educated audience, which meant that it was written in Latin. But here Chaucer is breaking with that. He wants this book to be accessible to the general public, so he writes in the English vernacular, which I also want to specify sounded very different from the English that we speak today, modern English. He wrote in something called Middle English, which, to just give you a quick sample of this is what Chaucer's prologue actually looked like. And people who study this stuff are better at pronouncing this than I am, but this is what it sounds like. Juan that April with his shore suita, the droughta of March hath pierced to the ruta, and bathed every veine in sweet liquor, of which vertu engendred is the fluor. Right? So a modern translation of that. When in April the sweet showers fall, and pierce the drought of March to the root, and all the veins are bathed in liquor of such power, and brings about the engendering of the flower. So, very different idea here. Basically, in a nutshell, the reason that Middle English sounds like this is because this is a conglomeration of all the different powers that were sort of coalescing on the English island, the island of Britain, during this period. There's the Norman invasion in 1066, the Anglo-Saxons coming in, and all these languages kind of mixed together. So there's this very kind of German soundingness to the Saxon language. And then a few decades after Chaucer wrote, English kind of went through something called the Great Vowel Shifts, which is why by the time Shakespeare starts writing at the end of the 16th century, it sounds a lot more like the English that we speak today. Okay, a little bit of a side note there. He writes during the dawn of the development of an English national literature, which is another reason he's important. He has an interesting life politically. From 1359 to 60, he fights the French. He gets captured. He's ransomed back to the English. He's a squire in King Edward III's household, so he's, again, very close to the English crown. He runs diplomatic errands to Spain, France, and Italy between 1372 and 78. And again, he's very heavily influenced in his writing by these Italian authors who were more or less doing what he was doing before he was doing it. He was involved in some during his lifetime, England underwent some internal political turmoil. There's this thing called the War of the Roses, where two factions of the royal family are basically competing for the crown. Shakespeare wrote a whole series of plays, 8 plays that kind of deal with this. But basically, during Chaucer's lifetime, Richard II ascends the throne, and then he's deposed and later murdered in 1399 by Henry Bolingbroke, who becomes Henry IV. So it's the Henrys versus the Richards. Chaucer, he survives this shift in political power and was very close with Henry IV's father, John of Gaunt. In 1381, there's also a revolt, an uprising that brings animosity between classes to a breaking point. There's also international turmoil. As I mentioned, he fought wars against France during this period because England was clashing with France and Scotland during Chaucer's lifetime. There's also religious turmoil. While this is well before the English Reformation, which takes place when Henry VIII takes the throne in the early 16th century, John Wycliffe is challenging the doctrine and economic power of the church during this time. So I think it's important to just pay attention to religion because Chaucer was not afraid of kind of mocking religion, as we'll see. He may have been very unappreciated as a poet in his day. His work also remains largely unpolitical and generally orthodox with his religious convictions. I think that's a little debatable, perhaps, but that's definitely what the editor of our book is promoting, and I do think it can be argued. He has 3 stages of his writing career. His early writings kind of focus on poetry written under the influence of the French court poetry, so he's very much kind of imitating this style. By the 1370s, he writes The House of Fame and Troilus and Cressida, which are poems written under the influence or critique of Dante. Again, very much like Boccaccio was also sort of responding to Dante's works. And again, I apologize that we didn't get a chance to read Dante this semester. But then finally, the English period is his late period. It's probably the period he's most well known for. The Canterbury Tales is obviously the work he's best known for as well, and it was unfinished at the time of his death. The plot of the Canterbury Tales is similar. This is going to sound a little similar to the plot of the Decameron because it is different storytellers telling their own story. But basically, the pilgrims meet at an inn, and they're all on their way to visit the shrine of Sir Thomas a Becket at Canterbury Cathedral. The pilgrims come from all walks of life. The stories they tell are often read as quote-unquote estate satires meant to comment on the life led by each speaker. So there are basically 3 tiers of English society that Chaucer is including here: the nobility, the clergy, and the laborers. And as you read the prologue to the Canterbury Tales, he introduces each one of the characters, each one of the pilgrims here. And the 2 that kind of represent the nobility as an ideal are the knight and the squire. There's the clergy, represented by the clerk and the parson, and then laborers represented by the yeoman and the plowman. Harry Bailey is also the name of the host of the inn, and he decides that what they're going to do is tell 2 tales each, one on their way to the cathedral and one on their way back. However, if you read all of the Canterbury Tales, there are only 24 tales included in it. So obviously, he doesn't get to everybody that he introduces. Estate satires tend to focus on the ills of society and how they can be cured. Chaucer's innovation is to focus attention on the psychological makeup of the characters. The characters generate sympathy and understanding from the reader, in addition to ridicule. And the Miller's Tale, in particular, the one I want you to read for this week, is you might recognize the form of it because it's also an example of a fableau, which we read a few weeks ago. Which again means little fable, a short tale in rhyming couplets. Most are anonymous of French origin, told between the 12th and the 14th century. And again, they're characterized by scatological and obscene humor. They promote hedonistic values. They celebrate the pleasures of food, wine, comfortable lodging, and sex, and focus on themes of social affectation or priestly misbehavior. And again, that's where I kind of see Chaucer maybe poking poking a little bit of fun at the clergy or the church. So I think that's maybe where that can be argued. The Miller's Tale. Sorry, yeah. So there's a prologue to this tale, which again I'd like you to read. And I think what I want to point out about the prologue is that basically the host, Harry Bailey, after the knight finishes the first tale of the whole pilgrimage, the first tale is told by the knight, and Harry Bailey comments on it, and he says, well, I want to hear from the monk next. But then the miller, who's extremely drunk at this point, interrupts and tells the reeve, he sort of introduces, like, the reason he wants to tell this story. And I think thinking about the frame and the prologue here can help us kind of think about what this story is actually about, what it's meant to be about. But basically, he says, a husband must not be inquisitive of God nor of his wife while she's alive, as long as he may find God's plenty there. For all the rest, he need not greatly care. So what is this story saying about a wife, and what is it saying about husbands and wives? So I'll rephrase that question later on as we get through this. But the plot of this story is fairly simple and straightforward. You have Nicholas, who's this student. He's interested in astrology. He's infatuated with this woman, Allison, who's the young wife of John. They all live in the same house together. John's a carpenter. He's much older than Allison. And then there's Absalom, who's the parish clerk, who's also infatuated with Allison. What ends up happening is Nicholas basically tries to seduce Allison. We can talk about whether or not his attempt at seduction is consensual or not. He says, I will kiss you. She responds to his advances by saying, I will not kiss you by my fay. Why, let go, Nicholas, or I will call for help and cry, alas. Do take your hands away for courtesy. But then only a few lines later, she kind of gives in. And so again, this is a story where we're being asked to laugh at something. It's supposed to be funny and lighthearted. But I think there is kind of there are these ways in which we can kind of question what's actually going on and what does this reveal about medieval culture here. So Nicholas and Allison decide they want an opportunity to actually sleep together. So they devise this elaborate plot to kind of trick John into thinking that the world is ending, because Nicholas, in his study of astrology, has discovered that a second flood is coming, and he instructs John to build 3 troughs for them to sleep in. They're going to tie them to the rafters of their roof, of the ceiling of their house. So they do that, and then Allison and Nicholas kind of sneak out of their troughs and go down to the bed, and they sleep together. And while they're doing that, Absalom walks by their window, and Absalom asks Allison for a kiss, but she sticks her ass out the window. He kisses her ass. Nicholas tries to get him to do it again, but this time he comes prepared with a hot poker and sticks it in Nicholas's ass. When he cries out for water, that wakes up John. John cuts himself down, thinking that the flood has come because he's crying about water. But when he cuts himself down, there is no water. He just falls down to the floor and breaks his arm. So in a way, you can kind of see how all the men here are dealt some sort of punishment. Nicholas gets burned with a poker. John breaks his arm. Absalom ends up kissing somebody's ass. He gets humiliated. But Allison kind of makes it out of this story without any blemishes in a way. So what's the moral of this fableau? Is it that questioning husbands will be punished, as the Miller's prologue suggests? And is there something kind of interesting about how women are represented here? Again, the kiss here is my favorite part. I'd encourage you to read this. I'll post this PowerPoint on Blackboard. And just to explain a few things, I might have to upload a second video here, but the term cuckold gets brought up here. Just to explain what that is, it's basically the husband of an adulterous wife. It derives from this term cuckoo, who are birds that sneak into another bird's nest to raise their young as their own. And it's often depicted in this time period with the imagery of a man wearing horns. It's kind of, so if you see references to horns, that's what's going on. An astrolabe is also a tool used by astrologers and astronomers during this time.